Well, hello and welcome to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center's David Taub Real Upstander film screening. My name is Thorin Turner. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, which is located in Glen Cove, New York. Tonight, as part of our Women's History Month programming, we are showing The Codebreaker, a film that follows up actually on a program that we held back in January with Amy Butler Greenfield, who is the author of a recent book published called The Woman All Spies Fear. And Amy Butler Greenfield's book and tonight's film both shed renewed light on the inspiring true story of Elizebeth Smith Friedman, a woman whose accomplishments had largely been forgotten or had been overshadowed. I will leave it to our commentator and to the film to share more information about this amazing woman. But before we get to that, let me, as I always like to do, put in a plug for some of our other upcoming programs. We actually have two upcoming programs about Meg Waite Clayton's book, The Last Train to London. The first is tomorrow afternoon when HMTC's Lewis Posner Memorial Library is hosting its monthly book club meeting. And the focus this month is on The Last Train to London. And then next Thursday, on March 24th, Meg Clayton will be joining us to talk about her book and to talk about the Kinder Transport, which is at the center of The Last Train to London. In between those programs, next Monday, March 21st, we are offering a sneak peek at some of the content that will be included in the upcoming concert at Carnegie Hall on April 20th. So join us to learn about the connections between some of the pieces of music that will be performed at the concert in Carnegie Hall, including details about Michel Assael's Auschwitz symphonic poem that was written in 1948, but has never been performed and will receive its world premiere in Carnegie Hall on April 20th. You can find out how to buy tickets to that show on our website. And overall, you can find details about these programs and all our upcoming programs on our website at www.hmtcli.org and then click on the events tab. Okay. Enough advertisements. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Let me talk about our plan for this evening. In a minute, Murray Taub will formally launch our program and introduce our guest commentator, Melissa Davis. Melissa will then give us some initial thoughts about some things to consider as we go into watching the film. And we will then screen The Codebreaker, which runs about, I think, 55 minutes or a little under. After the film, Melissa Davis will return to our stage, our virtual stage, for some post-film thoughts and to answer any questions you have about the work of Elizebeth Smith Friedman. So if you have questions that come up during the film, just jot them down in the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we will make sure to get to them after the screening. So that's our plan. Now, to formally start our program, let me invite, I'm just clicking on a button here, let me invite Murray Taub to our screen. Murray Taub is the woman who's behind most of the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center's film programs. She is a Holocaust survivor who has been volunteering as an educator, docent, and tour guide here at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center for a number of years. In addition to her work with school groups and serving on our Educational Advisory Committee, back in 2013, she launched the David Taub Real Upstander film series in honor of her late husband, who was also a survivor of the Holocaust. To date, Murray has helped bring nearly 30 films to our calendar, all of which have highlighted the dangers of being a bystander and the need for us all to be upstanders. So Murray, thank you so much for all you do for the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, and I pass the virtual baton to you to introduce our program this evening. Oh, just make sure you unmute there.
There we go. Okay, sorry. Thank you, everyone, for attending another film in our David Taub Real Upstanders film series. The HMTC Real Upstanders film series is named in honor of my husband, David Taub, who was a hidden child in a small village in the heart of France during the Second World War. David loved the movies, hence our film series. However, who among us doesn't love movies about the perceived underdog persevering? Who among us doesn't love the tantalizing idea of sending and receiving secret codes? Didn't we all do that at one point in our lives? However, the film that we are about to watch focuses on one person, a woman, who in spite of all odds, perilous national and international times, not only rises to the top of her profession, but retains her sense of equanimity and accomplishment in spite of the odds being against her. Truly a woman to be admired, respected, and acknowledged. Melissa Davis, our guest and facilitator for this evening, is the director of the Library and Archives at the George C. Marshall Foundation in Lexington, Virginia. Before coming to the Marshall Foundation, Melissa was an academic librarian specializing in history at Southern Virginia University for 10 years. She graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Library and Information Technology from the University of Maine in Augusta. Welcome, Melissa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. I appreciate that. And I am thrilled to join all of you this evening. I welcome you to the Marshall Foundation Library behind me. The Marshall Foundation was actually started by presidential edict. President Truman decided that a man of George Marshall's stature deserved something like a presidential library. And so all of his official papers and photographs and family records were gathered here. The land was donated by the Virginia Military Institute because George Marshall was the most famous graduate. And the building was dedicated in 1964. It was shortly after that William and Elizabeth Smith Friedman started looking at where they wanted their papers and their photos and their library to go to when they were ready to downsize from their Capitol Hill home. They had decided that they didn't want their collections going to the government. They were worried that they would all be stamped classified, disappear into an archive vault, and never be seen again. They wanted their papers in their library available for research. And so they started looking. They wanted a small organization that would value their collection and make it available to all who wanted to come and see it. We believe that William and General Marshall may have met in World War I when they were both working at the general headquarters in France, but we're not certain. And we certainly do know that they weren't friendly, they weren't well known to each other. And so when the Friedmans discovered that there was a Marshall Foundation in Lexington, Virginia, they thought that, well, maybe this organization had the same integrity of standards as the man that it was named after. And when they came to visit, they discovered this is where they wanted their papers to be. Although William died in 1969 before the donation of their collections, Elizabeth worked hard to finish the inventory of all of their things as she supervised the packing and the loading of their items. And then she got in her car there from their home in Capitol Hill and drove down here to Lexington following the truck and supervised the unloading. And then she spent a good amount of time here at the foundation with the library staff, making sure that they were comfortable and understood what a rare gift they had been given. She also sat for many interviews, taped interviews with the library staff here that we've added to her collection. The Elizabeth Smith Friedman collection and the William Friedman collections are some of the most popular that we have in the archive here. It is a large archive, and I get questions every day from people who want to know more, especially about Elizabeth, because you have to understand that Elizabeth not only worked under the veil of secrecy in code breaking for the government, but she also worked as a woman. And there were elements in the government that did not want anyone to know that she was actually doing the work for them. And between those two things, Elizabeth not being able to speak about her career and the government not allowing her to, she really became almost invisible to history. And we are thrilled to be able to join with you this evening and show this wonderful production that tells the story of Elizabeth Smith Friedman. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Melissa. So I'm going to turn it over to our behind the scenes AV technician, and he will get our movie started.
In March of 1942, German U-boats prowled the vast Atlantic Ocean in wolf packs, attacking scores of Allied transport ships as they headed towards war-torn Europe. In less than 3 months, the Nazi submarines had sunk more than 1 million tons of desperately needed supplies and killed thousands of soldiers. The U-boat captains had a secret weapon. Encrypted messages sent by Nazi spies in South America had provided them with the coordinates of the targeted ships.
We're talking about networks all over South America, an entire front in the Second World War.
But America had on its side one of the most skilled codebreakers in the world, Elizebeth Friedman.
She was a suburban mom. Nothing really to mark her as anything unusual, but she lived a double life.
In World War I, Friedman had trained the first team of codebreakers for the U.S. military. During Prohibition, she had taken on the most powerful gangsters in the country and brought down an international rum-running operation.
The gangsters put a hit out on Elizebeth, and the Coast Guard puts a protection detail on her.
Now, as she decrypted the intercepted messages on her desk, she knew everything she had learned in her career had led to this moment.
She was somebody who had the ability to see beyond what most other people could. She could see things starting to unlock in front of her eyes.
She was one woman fighting a secret army. Her success or failure could determine the outcome of the war.
Elizebeth Friedman was a code-breaking Quaker poet who hunted Nazi spies. And there's nobody like her then or since.
Elizebeth Smith Friedman's life was unexpectedly set on course during a visit to the bustling city of Chicago in 1916. 23 and full of dreams, she was hoping to escape the life she had been raised to expect.
Elizebeth came from a large Quaker family in small-town Indiana, and from a very young age, she felt like she didn't fit in. She even hated her own name. She called it the odious name Smith. And she hated it because she believed that whenever she was introduced as Miss Smith, she would be seen as something so ordinary. And she didn't want to be ordinary. She wanted to be extraordinary. She wanted an adventurous life.
Her mother, Sophia, had delivered 10 children. The first when she was only 17. Elizebeth, born in 1892, was the youngest.
Elizebeth often felt pity for her because Sophia's life had been completely overtaken, it seemed to Elizebeth, by childbearing and child-rearing. She didn't seem to be able to pursue any kind of a life of the mind. And to Elizebeth, that was horrifying, because Elizebeth was a very bookish kid. She loved to read. She loved poetry. She wrote her own poetry.
Her father was a Civil War veteran. He saw his youngest as a difficult child, and their relationship absolutely was difficult. Her father did not support her going to college. He was against further education, particularly for women. She manages to talk him into this. And he says she can have the money, but at 6% interest. She has to pay it all back.
In college, Elizabeth studied Greek and English literature. When she discovered Shakespeare, she became fascinated by the intricacies of language, sparking a passion that would drive her ambitions. After graduation, Elizabeth pursued one of the few careers available to women at the time and accepted a teaching job at a small Indiana school. She found the work uninspiring and quit after just a year. In June of 1916, she headed for Chicago in search of a new job. After a week of effort, she found nothing. With no income and no job prospects, Elizabeth had no choice but to return home in defeat. On her last day in the city, she indulged in a visit to the Newberry Library to see a rare treasure: Shakespeare's first folio, printed in 1623.
She's looking at this book of Shakespeare, and the librarian notices and says, "You're interested in Shakespeare, aren't you?" And Elizabeth says, "Well, yes." And the librarian says, "You know, it's funny. There's an odd, wealthy man who keeps coming to the library, and he's looking for somebody to help him with this project, to find some kind of secret that he thinks is hidden in this book."
An hour later, George Fabian was standing at her table. At 6'4", 250 pounds, the wealthy industrialist towered over her.
He walks right up to Elizabeth, and the first thing he says to her is, "Would you like to come out to Riverbank and spend the night with me?" She has no idea what to say to this. It's the most indelicate question that anyone has ever posed to her.
And he grabs her under the elbow, lifts her up. She's tiny, he's huge, and he frog marches her out the door to a waiting limousine, which takes them to the railway station.
Soon, Elizabeth was wandering the grounds of Fabian's vast riverbank estate, nestled on 350 acres of rolling hills in Geneva, Illinois. Strolling the Japanese garden, she was filled with a mix of astonishment and curiosity about the tycoon's eccentric kingdom.
George Fabian had so much money that he could do essentially anything that he wanted. And what he wanted to do was to build a playground for science. He would go out and hire some of the leading scientists of the day, bring them to Riverbank, essentially collecting these scientists, and he would set them loose and tell them to be spectacular, tell them to make breakthroughs, tell them to unlock the secrets of nature.
What captured most of Fabian's attention, however, was a literary project focused on proving that the works of William Shakespeare had been written by another author, the Elizabethan philosopher and scientist, Francis Bacon.
Fabian had this belief that William Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare, that actually Francis Bacon had written a code within the Shakespearean plays that demonstrated that Shakespeare was not the author that Bacon actually was.
Fabian assigned Elizabeth the job of ferreting out the secret messages he believed Bacon had implanted in the text. Excited by the challenge, she first had to master a method of encoding messages invented by Francis Bacon in 1623. In the Bacon system, each letter of the alphabet was assigned a combination of the letters A and B in groups of 5.
Essentially what he did is he said, okay, I'm going to take every letter of the alphabet and break it down into a binary system of A's and B's. The letter A would turn into 5 A's, A. The letter B was AAAB. The letter C and so on. This can be represented any way you want it to, as long as there's 2 different things you're using to represent the binary system. And this is what the legend was, that the first Shakespeare folio had this code written in 2 different typefaces throughout.
Once the differences in the typeface were identified and the letters sorted into clusters of 5, a hidden message would be revealed. The work was tedious, but Elizabeth discovered she had the patience to stare at characters on a page for hours on end.
What Elizabeth was required to do was peer through a magnifying glass and try to discern very subtle variations in the fonts on photographic enlargements of Shakespeare's plays. And that was how she was going to break the code and rewrite the history of English literature.
Her work with the Shakespeare manuscripts would bring her together with the young man who was photographing and enlarging the Shakespeare texts, William Friedman. Genetics was his field of expertise. Photography was his hobby. At Riverbank, he easily stood out.
William always wore a white starched shirt, which in that heat, I don't know how he didn't perspire to death, but he always looked very together, very cool. His hair was always combed perfectly. This was a man who knew how to dress.
There are a lot of photos of just Elizabeth, and you can tell that William is gazing down at his camera into the glass and seeing an image of her and probably smiling. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. He was very quickly falling in love.
The couple were an unlikely match. She was a Quaker from the Midwest, and he was a Jewish immigrant from Russia.
Late in his life, one of William Friedman's colleagues asked him how he got into cryptology. According to the story, he had a sly smile on his face and he said, "I was seduced."
Working across from each other day by day, they began digging into Fabian's collection of code-breaking books, exchanging insights and ideas.
Instead, Elizabeth was able to bring William into the fold and say, look, you can take your very mathematical, scientific approach to understanding codes and ciphers. I can bring my poetry and language skills, and together we'll be unstoppable.
As they began to master rudimentary skills, however, they saw little indication of embedded codes in the Shakespeare manuscripts.
Every now and then there will be a letter that is slightly different. Now, it could be just because of the way the typeface struck the paper. There might be a little tail off a letter, or a letter might be a little wider. They're random marks, and they can be made by any typesetter, especially back in the 16th century. And so they're really rather meaningless.
Now they both agreed that the central project at Riverbank had no scientific validity. It was all a pipe dream. It was a kind of delusion.
Disheartened by their revelation, they saw no future in code breaking. Still, they saw a future with each other. In May of 1917, Elizabeth and William stole away from Riverbank to get married in Chicago.
William's family was shocked and appalled by the marriage. They wanted to see him marry a Jewish woman. His brother later said that if William had been living in Pittsburgh at the time, in the close-knit Jewish community there, he would have been exiled.
Two of them go ahead, and despite the differences in their background, despite the family opposition, despite the lack of money, despite all the many reasons why they should not get married, they do.
The newlyweds hoped to start a new life away from Riverbank. World events, however, would upend their plans. A month before they wed, the United States had entered the Great War in Europe. A war unlike anything that had come before, in part because of the invention of the radio. Suddenly, the air was full of messages, relaying information that could win or lose a battle, destroy a regiment, or sink a ship. All of it easily intercepted by anyone with an antenna.
The invention of radio completely transformed the value of code breaking. So it put an incredible premium on cryptography, on strong codes and ciphers, because now that those messages were flying through the air, they had to be protected. And the problem for America is that on the eve of World War I, the United States was completely unprepared to break codes in the war.
The United States had no code-breaking agency or bureau in the United States military. It just didn't exist. There was no NSA, there was no CIA. The military branches had their own very, very small intelligence agencies. We're talking about dozens of people, not thousands in this case.
At Riverbank, George Fabian saw an opportunity to serve his country and to enhance his reputation. He established the first dedicated code-breaking unit in America, and much to their disbelief, placed Elizabeth and William in charge. Soon, the War, Navy, State, and Justice Departments were sending thousands of secret messages to Riverbank for decryption.
So William and Elizabeth Friedman, at this point, hadn't really done this systematically for very long. They kind of played with it a little bit. But all of a sudden, they're being asked to break codes for the United States military in a world war. Talk about on-the-job training. This is as deep as on-the-job training gets.
The couple scrambled to expand their knowledge of code breaking, starting with the most fundamental concepts, like the difference between a cipher and a code.
A code is when you take a word or even a phrase and you replace it with another word or a phrase. So if we have the word gun, we might say every place the word gun is, we're going to put Bob instead. That way you're able to replace the words, but if someone intercepts your message, they may not actually know there's a secret message there because it reads like plain text. A cipher, on the other hand, is taking individual letters or groups of letters and changing them through some process, through some algorithm, into other letters, into numbers, into symbols, into anything, so that you can mix up the message and make it unreadable.
Using a method that had been around for hundreds of years, they began decrypting messages using frequency analysis.
This is what's called a frequency chart. This is what allows a code breaker to very effectively look through a enciphered message and say, okay, look, there's a lot of N's, there's a lot of G's, there are a lot of Q's. So the likelihood is those are going to be some of these very common letters in the English language, E's, T's, N's, A's. If we understand this in a very mathematical way, it can help us to attack secret messages and break them down and understand what they actually mean.
Elizabeth quickly discovered that she was quite good at spotting patterns hidden in the texts. Before long, though, William and Elizabeth reached the limits of what was known about codes and ciphers, and they began inventing their own methods.
They figured out methods of solving secret messages that had never been imagined before. The first 8 months of World War I, this sounds incredible, but it's completely true. Elizabeth, William, and their colleagues at Riverbank broke all messages for every part of the US military and the Department of Justice.
They documented their breakthroughs in 8 volumes, known as the Riverbank Publications, which established a mathematical foundation to the principles of cryptology.
Prior to the publications at Riverbank from Elizabeth and William, cryptology had been thought of as a field for linguists, for people with knowledge about foreign cultural areas, and perhaps math might be a tool. But the Riverbank Laboratories publications turned cryptology from language to statistics.
In an age when code breaking was becoming a weapon of war, Elizabeth and William were forging a new science of immense power. It was a heady time for Elizabeth. She was training the first generation of code breakers for the US military. The couple were so captivated by cryptology. For fun, they embedded codes everywhere, even the officer trainee class photo. As the group gathered, They instructed everyone assembled how to pose.
And if you're just looking at the picture, you're like, man, whoever decided to shoot this wasn't very disciplined. A good chunk of the people in the photograph are looking forward, but a good chunk are all looking to the side.
And it turns out that each person in the photo stands for a letter in Bacon's biliteral cipher. So the people who are looking off to the side are the B form of the cipher, and the people who are looking straight ahead are the A form. And when you put it all together, the people in Bacon's cipher spell out the phrase, knowledge is power, which is one of Bacon's mottos, and a motto that William and Elizabeth adopted as their own. And it's not written in letters, but it's written in people.
The Friedmans' work at Riverbank was an eye-opener for the U.S. military. 6 months into the war, the Army established its own Cipher Bureau in Washington. With the workload at Riverbank dwindling, William signed up for military duty as a field codebreaker in Europe. Elizabeth wanted to do field work as well, but she could not. Women were excluded from serving at the front.
Being left behind had to be incredibly difficult for Elizabeth. Not only is the man that she loves being sent off to fight a war, but this was her field. She taught William how to break codes and ciphers. This is a key way to move forward your career. William could do it, she couldn't.
And worse still, she would be on her own at Riverbank.
It was a terrifying time for her. She let it be known in letters to William that George Fabian was not treating her well, that he was pressuring her. There's a reference in one of William's letters to the fact that Fabian might have sexually harassed Elizabeth, might have propositioned her. William was very angry. He called Fabian that nameless rascal in that letter and said he wanted to hurt him, to beat him up. And so when they were reunited, they were highly motivated to get the hell out of there.
At war's end, William used his military contacts to line up a job in Washington. He arrived in Washington with a reputation earned on the battlefield. Elizabeth arrived in Washington as William's wife. Technological innovations were fueling a global race to create ever more advanced devices for making and breaking codes. The post-war world was still a dangerous place. In 1921, William went to work for the Army Signal Corps, developing new cipher machines. Elizabeth was also offered a job, but at half of William's salary. She took the position, but left after a year. She believed her code-breaking days were over. In 1923, Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter, soon followed by the birth of a son. Code-breaking unexpectedly entered Elizabeth's life again in 1925, when a Coast Guard officer knocked on the door of her suburban home with an urgent request. He explained that the Coast Guard's network of radio towers had intercepted hundreds of encrypted messages, but no one knew how to break them. Decrypting the messages might help them gain the upper hand against a deadly adversary. The Prohibition Act, signed into law several years earlier, had triggered an explosion of illegal trafficking in alcohol. Mobsters and gangsters ruled the streets.
Murder was rampant, and it became not just murder of gangster on gangster, but they were starting to murder anybody who opposed them. The federal police didn't even really understand the concept of organized crime.
A massive black market rises up, and it's controlled by gangsters, racketeers, and mafiosi. And very quickly, they make a mockery out of the Coast Guard.
The Coast Guard was charged with stopping the deluge of liquor coming in by sea. But it only had 200 boats to patrol 5,000 miles of coastline. The rum runners, on the other hand, had unlimited resources. Huge ocean-going vessels served as motherships that stored millions of dollars worth of liquor in their holds. A fleet of smaller crafts, called black ships, would divvy up the cargo and transport it back to shore. Logistics made possible by the use of shortwave radios and sophisticated codes. The Coast Guard officer pleaded with Elizabeth for help. She was no teetotaler, but Elizabeth saw the damage organized crime was doing to the country. During her first 3 months on the job, she single-handedly decrypted 2 years' worth of backlogged messages.
It's basically Elizabeth and a secretary filing her decrypts. And she's doing all of that work during those years. She says she ends up looking at about 25,000 intercepts a year. That's just astonishing. It's really a war.
Elizabeth, however, was not just decrypting the messages. She was weaponizing the data she was gathering.
What Elizabeth does is she begins the development of strategic intelligence, which nobody has done to this point. And what that means is she takes the information that she's obtaining in these broken codes and ciphers, which are basically the plans and intentions of the gangsters, and she begins to figure out who owns the ships, where a ship is scheduled to leave from, where those ships are going, who's meeting those ships. All of these arrangements were made with wireless radio. She was able to explain basically to the US government and all of its federal law enforcement agencies what organized crime looked like, how they were doing their job, and how to stop them. And that is really visionary.
By 1931, Elizabeth's work was so indispensable, the Coast Guard approved her plan to build an official code-breaking unit. One of only a handful of such units in the country, and the first to be run by a woman.
She was allowed to hire junior code breakers and train them. She was given a raise to $3,800 a year, which is not a lot of money, but a bump for her. And she got a new title along with it. She was called the cryptanalyst in charge, essentially the chief code breaker for the Coast Guard.
For a mother with young children, a home to run, and a husband who worked equally long hours, it was an exhausting time. A decade into Prohibition, the crime syndicates had grown into multinational businesses run with exacting efficiency. But with Elizabeth's intelligence in tow, the US government could finally take the mobsters to court. Elizabeth became the key witness in a series of sensational trials, starting with the prosecution of Conexco, the largest rum-running enterprise in the world.
They had the network from the manufacture of the liquor to the final distribution of that liquor to speakeasies and nightclubs. When the government went after Conexco, it would be like the government going after Walmart today.
With a virtual monopoly on bootlegging in the Pacific and the Gulf of Mexico, Conexco supplied liquor to the most notorious mobster in the country, Al Capone. Within a year, the US government indicted Conexco's top rank, which included Capone's brother. In 1933, at the trial in New Orleans, prosecutors called upon Elizabeth to testify against some of the most dangerous men in the country.
There were a lot of Prohibition agents who had already been killed in the line of duty.
There are these plainclothes people that she doesn't know that are there to keep her from being whacked by the bad guys. But it wouldn't have occurred to her not to testify against them. These people had to be put away. That was the whole point of breaking the codes.
When Elizabeth took the stand, she was grilled mercilessly by Al Capone's attorneys, who worked to undermine her credibility.
Whenever Elizabeth tried to explain how she solved the messages, these 6 lawyers, men, would often stand up and object and say that it was some kind of witchcraft, that code breaking was not science, that Elizabeth was just making a guess. She got so fed up with the repeated objections of the defense attorneys that she asked a judge if she could have access to a blackboard. And Elizabeth proceeded to give a class in code breaking. And by the time she was finished, the defense attorneys had nothing else to say.
They must have been thinking that they were going to be able to bowl her over and make her testimony irrelevant. And instead, she takes control of that and, seals the deal. She gets the conviction.
Elizabeth became a national celebrity. One newspaper praised her class in cryptology. Another described her as a pretty woman who protects the United States. Reporters expressed surprise that one woman could take down some of the most dangerous gangsters in the country.
This is juicy stuff. These are murderers and these are people who will become household names in America. And then along comes this woman who is the key witness at the trial to get these guys thrown in prison. They don't talk about her skills. They don't talk about her brains, her ability to break these codes and to bring these gangsters to justice. They talk about how she looks, how she's dressed, that she's this dainty little woman who is bringing these big, Al Capone type mobsters to justice.
William was delighted that his wife was finally getting the recognition she deserved. "I'm as proud as I can be," he told her. As Elizabeth's work was seeing the light of day, Williams was burrowing deeper into the shadows. By the late fall of 1939, Elizabeth knew something was terribly wrong with her husband.
He developed mood swings. That's what Elizabeth called them, mood swings or down swings. Elizabeth was trying to figure out what was going on. She assumed that he was working on a very difficult project at work. She didn't know what it was. He didn't tell her, and he couldn't tell her.
Williams' work for Army intelligence was classified top secret. He was breaking into the encryption machines of America's enemies. The machines had reached a new level of complexity. Many were considered unbreakable. With the start of the Second World War in Europe, Williams' work reached a new level of urgency.
There's Blitzkrieg. You see Paris fall. You see that Britain is left standing almost alone. You see that the Japanese are starting to make overtures to be joined in alliance with Germany and with Italy. It's looking very bad, and William, in addition, as a Jewish man, is aware that terrible things are happening to Jewish people in Germany. So I think the weight was colossal.
William was trying to pry open a Japanese machine called Purple, a device he had never seen or even had diagrams for.
William and his team at the Army worked around the clock to try to reverse engineer these Japanese cipher machines. Because if they could, then they would essentially be able to read the minds of the Axis powers, Japan and Nazi Germany.
William had to keep all that inside. He had a small group of people he worked with that he could talk to, but they all worked for him. And because he internalized all this stuff, it just burned him up inside until he finally broke.
Williams' team finally cracked Purple in September of 1940. 3 months later, he had a complete breakdown and checked himself into the psychiatric unit of Walter Reed General Hospital. Elizabeth watched in dismay as he sank deeper and deeper into a depression.
William at that point was still the main breadwinner in the household. He made much more money than Elizabeth did. And so the fact of him being in the psych ward, the uncertainty about his future created a much bigger uncertainty about both of their lives.
Every day for the nearly 3 months he was hospitalized, Elizabeth made the exhausting trip to see her husband.
She is absolutely essential to William's recovery. The medical establishment just let them sort it out themselves. And William says later that she was the person who sent down the rope to the terrible morass that he was in. She pulled him out of the swamp. She did it by willpower. She did it by faith in him.
After he was discharged, he returned to his job at the Army, but he would struggle with clinical depression for the rest of his life.
Elizabeth and William had always been equals, a team. After William's breakdown in 1941, he would never quite be the same. And so Elizabeth would have to step up. From now on, she would, in many ways, have to be the stronger of the two.
In December 1941, after a surprise Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, the U.S. military immediately ramped up its code-breaking capabilities. Elizabeth's team had just shifted from the Coast Guard to the Navy. Now a military operation, the Navy placed a uniformed officer with much less experience in charge of the unit.
The Navy had a rule that women couldn't be in charge of men, and so she had to take a secondary position to a man who wasn't as good as she was.
She had to deal with the pain and the frustration of losing leadership of something that she had created, that she had built, and that was really her baby.
The unit's assignment was to monitor communications between a Nazi spy ring in South America and the German High Command.
There had been a high amount of German immigration to South America in the early 20th century. There were places that had German towns with German street names, German newspapers, German schools. In addition, you had homegrown fascist movements. You had movements in Brazil, in Paraguay, and other countries where you see real similarities with what is going on with Hitler's Germany and what's happening in Mussolini's Italy.
Decoding messages written in German wasn't a problem for Elizabeth. She was now so skilled at recognizing the various statistical properties of foreign languages, a translator could do the rest. In her rum runner days, she had even decrypted messages in Chinese. Among the decrypted messages, one name appeared over and over: Sargo.
She doesn't know it yet, but she's starting to suspect she's onto something big, and she is. Sargo is the code name for a man named Johannes Siegfried Becker. And Becker is the SS's main man in South America. He is part of Hitler's elite.
As Elizabeth began to decode Sargo's messages, she made a startling revelation. His network was transmitting the locations of Allied ships to U-boats in the Atlantic.
One of the most important intelligence targets for the Germans is information about Allied shipping, because it would be so easy for the Germans to pick off these supply ships one by one, or to take out entire convoys all at once if they had accurate information about what route they were taking, that they could knock the English out of the war, and without the English, the war is essentially over.
In March of 1942, Elizabeth decrypted a series of ominous dispatches about the largest of the Allied supply ships, the Queen Mary. With her record-breaking speed and size, the Queen Mary's military value was so great, Adolf Hitler was offering $250,000 to the U-boat captain who could bring her down. On this trip, more than 8,000 men stood to lose their lives if the ship was sunk. Guided by the secret messages, the U-boats found the Queen Mary off the coast of Brazil. But before they could strike, Elizabeth's decrypts were relayed to the ship's captain. He was able to take evasive maneuvers and bring the ship safely to port. As soon as Elizabeth started unlocking Sargo's messages, the balance in the Atlantic began to tip.
The information could be given to American forces first for a ship to take evasive action, and also for the hunter-killer teams that the Americans had in the South Atlantic. And many U-boats were sunk based on this kind of information.
The work that Elizebeth Friedman is doing is some of the most important work of the Second World War. It is allowing the supply line to exist.
Then, without warning, the Brazilian police started rounding up the Nazi spies, driving Sargo further underground. Within days, the airwaves went silent.
One of the worst things that you can do if you're chasing spies is to arrest them before you're done following them and watching them and seeing what they're doing. Because the easiest way for a country to know that you've broken their communication system or that they have a leak somewhere is if you round up all their spies.
Elizabeth was stunned to learn that her work had been tripped up by one of her own. The Brazilians were conducting the arrests at the behest of the American FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover.
Hoover wants the glory. Hoover wants the headlines. That was really stupid of him to do. This is really life and death. Hoover is now completely cutting us off from this life-saving intelligence that's allowing us to keep our convoys safe in the Atlantic Ocean. This puts Elizabeth and her team back at square one.
Sargo escaped and immediately rebuilt the network. The spies set up 50 new circuits, each adopting a far more complex system of codes. Month after month, the unsolved messages piled up. Elizabeth suspected that the codes were being generated by a highly complex machine called the Enigma, used by the German intelligence services. There were several models of the Enigma. The British were using a newly invented decoding device to crack into the version used by the German military. The machine Elizabeth was facing was slightly less intricate, but not by much. Her tools were still only pencil and paper. Day after day, she waded through the messages. After 2 months, she spotted a chink in the Enigma's armor. She intercepted a cache of 28 messages, all sent in the same key, a careless mistake made by the spies. The breakthrough enabled her to make inroads into the machine's system. She lined up the messages one below the other in a technique called solving in depth.
When you solve in depth and you put papers next to each other or one on top of the other and you're looking at what is the first letter in each of these messages, what is the second letter in each of these messages, once you have the knowledge that you're dealing with the same key every day, then you can actually start breaking down words and understanding what letters are turning into others.
I think that Elizabeth would be the first to say that you are always looking for the mistake that the other side is making. You find a little doorway that's been left open just a smidge, and that's where you attack, and that's where you go in.
Finally, she was able to follow Sargo's activities again. The decrypted messages laid bare ominous new developments in South America.
There is a coup in Argentina, a fascist coup, in the summer of 1943. At the end of that, Sargo is really on the inside. In Bolivia, again, he is working with people who want to turn the government toward the Nazis. And in December of 1943, lo and behold, there is a fascist coup in Bolivia. And this is scary stuff for the United States.
The fear is that the Germans will start a front in South America. This could be a dramatic game changer that could make it very difficult for us to fight the war overseas because we'd be worried about fighting the war at home.
From her tiny office in Washington, Elizabeth shadowed Sargo's every move. Any which way they turned, his spies were outflanked.
In the end, Elizabeth is able to give information to the Allies, which allows them to break up the spy ring and do it in such a way that the Germans have no idea that the spy ring was broken up because their codes had been broken.
German-backed revolutions in Bolivia and Chile were crushed. Argentina's relationship with Germany splintered. Within months, the Nazi threat in the Western Hemisphere was eliminated. Sargo went into hiding. He would never rebuild his network again. Elizabeth's work in South America was an astonishing testament to the power of code breaking. But it would be a private and lonely victory. She had signed a Navy oath promising her silence until death. She could tell no one, not even William. And she could do nothing as J. Edgar Hoover took credit for her crowning achievement. He took all the decrypts Elizabeth had sent, all 4,000 of them, and had them stamped with FBI identification numbers, erasing Elizabeth and her team from the official record.
Elizabeth just had to kind of grin and bear it, and after a while, she wasn't grinning so much anymore. It kind of ate at her, but there was very little that she could do.
In her Christmas card in 1944, she wrote friends that she was just carrying on a routine Navy job. William added a P.S. Elizabeth was, is, and continues to be the most fascinating woman I've ever known. World War II ended in August 1945. A year later, Elizabeth's unit was disbanded. She was 54 years old and out of a job. Code breaking by pencil and paper had become a thing of the past. Computers were the future.
The post-war era will be like nothing Elizabeth has ever seen, and she knows that. She knows it's changing. She can see that her era is ending.
William continued to work for the government. In the early 1950s, he suffered a series of heart attacks and struggled with mental illness.
He was so depressed that he was unable to even start his hand to move on a pad of paper at the office. And so Elizabeth would put her hand on top of his and move the pencil for him. And in that way, he was able to begin to work, begin to draw, begin to think, and come to life. To me, that says everything about the Friedmans, who they were, their bond.
William died of a heart attack on November 2nd, 1969. Though Elizabeth's career as a codebreaker was long over, code-breaking itself was becoming a critical part of keeping the nation safe. The U.S. government had created the National Security Agency, the NSA, in 1952, and charged it with collecting cryptographic communications and strengthening the nation's codes. It would become the largest, most secretive, and far-reaching arm of U.S. intelligence gathering.
Even though we're not fighting a shooting war, we're keeping secrets, and a lot of them, and not letting the American public know what the government is doing in its name. Elizabeth felt that it was going too far, collecting too much information, becoming too intrusive, violating too much privacy. Some of the same themes that will basically pester the NSA for the next several decades.
Even as intelligence gathering grew into something Elizabeth could hardly recognize, her methods formed the basis of code breaking for decades to come.
She helped to create an immensely powerful new science of code breaking. And so there's still a good portion of her DNA in code breaking today, even though it's been mathematized and done on computers. She laid a foundation for what happens at American intelligence agencies every day today.
Elizabeth struggled in her final years as her savings dried up. She died on October 31st, 1980, in a nursing home in New Jersey. She took her secret life to the grave. The government kept the files detailing Elizabeth Friedman's history-making work locked away for 62 years. In 2008, decades after her death, they were finally declassified.
If we could miss something as big as Elizabeth, who is crucial in 2 world wars, who fights crime, who fights the mob, if we missed her, who else are we missing?
Well, I hope you enjoyed the film. I think it draws our attention really to a fascinating figure. And as I said, somebody, and as the film said, somebody who has kind of fallen off or had fallen off our screen, off our radar, but has been brought back to us by this film and a number of books now. Melissa, I want to bring you back in here and have you share any kind of concluding remarks after watching the film. What are some things that we should take away from it, or what are the things that that strike you as we've just watched the film? And then maybe we can get to some Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Thorin. I think that we need to recognize the fact that William and Elizabeth started out creating the science of cryptology and codifying it in a way that they could translate it and teach it to others. And then their careers diverged, she working for the Coast Guard and the Navy, he working for the Army. And even though they were married, they could not speak about what they did at work. And I think that for William, that weighed heavier on him than it did on Elizabeth. But then after retirement, they were again able to come together, and they followed research for projects and wrote a book together and really ended their careers the way they started their career, together.
Let me just encourage people out there, if they have questions about the film, about Elizabeth Smith Friedman, or about the George Marshall Foundation and its archives, please feel free to type those questions in. Let me ask a couple of questions just to get us going, Melissa. One, I'm just wondering about if you could talk a little more about the role that the archives, your archives, and this collection of papers played in this film. I know you were involved in this film. So tell us a little about that interaction.
When Sarah Keeling and the crew that wrote and produced This American Experience episode got in touch with me, it was just a few weeks before the world shut down for COVID. And so we had to reinvent how one does research for a documentary. And there were a lot of phone calls, and we discovered this thing called Zoom. And we mailed hard drives back and forth to transfer large amounts of information. And we got very good at using Dropbox. It really was a challenge because the crew that was working on producing this show were in New York City, not even together. They were working from home. And the researcher, Sarah, was working from her apartment. and couldn't even go outside. And I was in the mountains of Virginia. And so it really was making this episode without ever doing the normal things of traveling to the archives and doing research in person and getting to know the people that they would be interviewing who couldn't travel very far to be interviewed. It just really was kind of a different circumstance than most that we had dealt with, and the way that we normally did research in the past.
And in the film, most of the images and the kind of pages that we see, are those from the collection at the George Marshall Archives?
Right. The pages, the documents are from the William and Elizabeth Smith Friedman collections. A lot of the photos are also. And it was really fun because here we have the producers who didn't know what we had, and I didn't really know what they wanted because we couldn't be together to discover it. And so it was a challenge.
I bet. And I mean, I'm assuming that the collection was not fully digitized, at least when you started, although it sounds like you had to digitize a lot of it if you were sending files back and forth.
Right, it isn't digitized. Digitization is a lot more than just scanning a document or scanning a photo. It requires then attaching information to the photo and uploading it to the library catalog to make it discoverable. And you are looking at the library staff for the George C. Marshall Foundation. And on top of that, I had a limited amount of time in the building because we were, for the vast majority of this, working from home. And so I was only in the building about 4 hours a week, which made it even tougher. So it really adapt and overcome kind of was the motto.
Now, am I right that the film is based, at least roughly, on Jason Fagone's book that came out in 2017 about Elizabeth Smith Friedman? So he had no doubt already done a lot of research in the archives and copied things. Right. And is that right?
That is true. The librarian who preceded me, Paul Barron, was so enamored with Elizabeth and the fact that nobody even really knew who Elizabeth was, that every researcher who came into the archives, he would bring up some of her collection and say, look, somebody needs to write about this. Somebody needs to write a book about her. And it was finally Jason who said, oh my, and became very interested and followed through on it and reintroduced Elizabeth to the American public.
And you highlight right there. I mean, I come from an academic background, and the importance and the value of the archivists and librarians cannot be understated. And it sounds like right there, you guys knew what a great collection this was, but you needed somebody to kind of take it and run with it. And finally, that started to happen. And yes. You said at the beginning that this is now one of the most well-used archive or collections in the archives you have. Did that start with Jason Fagone, or when did the kind of floodgates open?
I really think that she was somewhat known in a very minor way. It was along the lines of, oh, William Friedman, yeah, the NSA codebreaker, and his wife Elizabeth, didn't she do some code breaking too? That kind of an attitude. Jason's book really opened up a lot of people's eyes, and since then there have been many articles and Amy Butler Greenfield, who you saw in this production, has recently completed her book, The Woman Allspice Fear. And so we are seeing books and articles and productions about Elizabeth. And this is truly important because Elizabeth obviously could not talk about her own career, and her career was really erased by the FBI. Everything that she did during World War II was erased. And so we have this woman who created a science with her husband and who did these incredible things, who can be so inspirational for young women today who wish to go into STEM and STEAM careers, that it can be done. She was a woman from the Midwest who majored in English literature, and look what she did with it. And so I feel like it's so important for young women today to have these kinds of role models, that they can believe that they too can go and do extraordinary things if they're willing to work hard.
But we've got a couple of questions coming in, and I want to pose them to you. One is just about why hasn't the kind of women's movement brought attention to Elizabeth Smith Friedman before this? Why has it really taken so long?
Well, I mean, you have to understand that the Coast Guard didn't even make her records declassified. These are the records from the 20s and 30s until, you know, the early 2000s. She was really very hidden. Everything was very stamped, classified, and limited in knowledge. And so it's really only in the last 10 or 12 years that her information is starting to be able to be accessed so that people can see what she's done. And so I think that her time as a leading woman of the 20th century will come as more people are familiar with who she is. So productions like this American Experience episode are extremely important in bringing that information to people who can then say, oh, this is incredible. More people need to know about her.
Absolutely. Somebody also asked just about how this film can be used by teachers, and I mean, this is an American Experience film, so that people should be able to go to their PBS website or the PBS website, and they can find this film. It's readily available, so a wonderful resource, as you say. Somebody else is asking about, do we know what, or to what degree, Elizabeth Smith Friedman's motivation during World War II drew from the fact that she was married to a Jewish man, or from her own Quaker background? Was there a kind of religious motivation for her work?
Well, I think that there was certainly a patriotic motivation. So she was, of course, privy to a lot of the information that was being passed from South America to Germany, and from Germany back to South America. So I'm fairly certain that she knew what was going on in Germany. I think a lot of people in the government knew what was going on, starting in Germany and extending to other countries in the creation, really, of the Holocaust. I think that her belief in good and evil played a lot, a heavy hand in what she accomplished. And the fact that she knew that she had skills that could help good triumph. As a personal aside, the decrypting that she did for the troop ships going from the United States over to North Africa that we saw in the show, and then later from New York into Ireland, into England, it means an awful lot to me, because my father was on the Queen Mary as it made one of the runs from New York to Great Britain. And so her work very well could have impacted the safe arrival of the 29th Infantry Division, which was my dad's unit, that then went on to fight on Omaha Beach at D-Day and in the Battle of the Bulge. And so she had a real effect on the outcome of the war, but she also had a very personal effect, perhaps, on my own life.
Wow, that's amazing, amazing. Somebody is asking just for the name of the book, for Jason Fagon's book. I think it's The Woman Who Smashed Codes. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. I'm wondering if there were things that that might have been left out of the film, that other parts of the collection, other parts of Elizabeth Smith Friedman's story that you're familiar with, that maybe found the cutting room floor when it came to this 1-hour film.
There was a court case that took place in Texas that didn't make the film that I found fascinating. Elizabeth was going in to testify again against the rum runners. And this was post New Orleans. So the defense had already seen what she did in New Orleans in the class that she taught on cryptography. And so they thought they were prepared. Their lead defense attorney was female, and they thought that would defeat Elizabeth on the stand, because it wasn't the jury wouldn't feel like the men were ganging up on her if the lead attorney was female. And Elizabeth had not a single good thing to say about this attorney, from the fact that she wondered where she ever studied law, that certainly wasn't in a law school, to the fact that the woman had no manners whatsoever, and that she smacked and cracked chewing gum the whole time she was conducting her examination of Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, again, triumphed because she was able to produce the original decrypts and allow the jury to see that what she was saying was in fact true. And so it all came to naught, thinking that they could defeat Elizabeth with this female attorney. And I just thought that that was a little bit funny, certainly showed Elizabeth's judge of character, so to speak. Elizabeth also loved to dress up. She and William were both very sharp dressers. They believed in dressing for dinner, but she loved to dress up and go out to dinner with William. And obviously during World War II, this just really didn't happen. They were both working extremely long hours, and their opportunities to go out were so severely limited by the war and by their exhaustion that they didn't do it very often. And it was Washington's birthday, I believe, in February of '44, that they had the opportunity to go out, to dress up and go out to dinner. And Elizabeth wrote to her daughter, Barbara, who was actually living at that time in Panama, which was the Canal Zone was still part of the United States at that point in time. And she wrote to her daughter, Barbara, that she'd spent an hour and a quarter getting ready. And how much fun she had just being out with William and kind of leaving all of the stress of their job behind. Another thing that I really love about Elizabeth is she loved flowers. And she loved a rose in particular. It was called a talisman rose. And so William always gifted her with bouquets of these talisman roses for important times, like their anniversary and her birthday. And when they sold their home, their family home on Military Road, and downsized to their town home on Capitol Hill, one of the first things he did was plant talisman climbing roses at the back wall of their garden. And they would just bloom prolifically. And Elizabeth would gather them by the armful and bring them into the house and put them in every vase she could find so she could enjoy her flowers.
You know, you mentioned that, and I know this came out somewhat in the film and in Amy Butler Greenfield's book. I mean, the romance, the love that William and Elizabeth had was really something special and shaped their whole lives.
It truly was. I mean, it was a 50-year love affair. They never fell out of love with each other. And they were very dedicated to each other and very faithful to each other, even during the difficult times of William's depression. Elizabeth never stopped believing in him and really became his strength when he needed it. And of course, he was grateful to her, but he knew that she wasn't doing it out of pity. She wasn't doing it out of desperation so that he could go back to work and provide for their family. She was doing it out of love.
I've got three more questions I want to get into the mix here, and then I know we need to wrap things up. But the first, somebody is asking about, to what degree did Elizebeth Smith Friedman work with or was familiar with Alan Turing's work in code breaking going on in England with the early form of a computer? Was she aware of that? Did they work together, anything like that?
I'm sure she was aware of that. William was more aware of that. In fact, William actually visited Bletchley Park. And when Alan Turing came to the United States to visit William's Arlington Hall, which was our American version of Bletchley Park, he was denied entrance and caused a small brouhaha that drew in Field Marshal Dill and General Marshall into the mix, because William's team was reverse engineering the Enigma machine using switches from AT&T. And AT&T said, no foreigners can see these switches because this is our proprietary equipment. And General Marshall and Field Marshal Dill put the kibosh on that very quickly to allow him to visit. So I know that they were definitely aware of each other. I think it's ironic that the Bletchley Park had hundreds of people working on reverse engineering and deciphering, breaking the Enigmas. And Elizabeth had a handful of people. and they did exactly the same thing. In fact, at one point, William's team at Arlington Hall and Elizabeth's team at the Navy were both working on reverse engineering the same Enigma machine, and they didn't know the other was working on it because, of course, they couldn't talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, and one of the things that strike me is, I mean, there was a film a few years ago about Alan Turing, and I think people saw the elaborate early computer that was developed to deal with it. And then we have Elizebeth Smith Friedman, where the computer is her brain. And she's doing that all, I mean, by seeing whatever she sees. And somebody asked this question too, like, how do we explain her extraordinary deciphering skills?
I think Elizabeth had the talent for seeing patterns. She could find patterns that other people couldn't find. And she also had the determination to just never, ever quit. When she was able to get a series of messages from a short period of time that used the same cipher and lay them on top of each other, the way they talked about in the film, she literally would go through page by page by page and drill down and see what was used first. And one of the things Elizabeth noticed was that the Germans tended to be very formal in their communications, and all too often they started out a message with Heil Hitler and they ended a message with Heil Hitler, and that gave her a doorway in which to get in to break those messages. So it was creativity, it was determination, and it was just the talent of how her brain worked.
Let me ask you one last question, and that is, it's really somewhat unrelated, but what's the collection that people should be going to now to write the next book that draws on some of the archives in your collection? You know, what's the next unused, underutilized archival collection that you have that maybe people should be looking at?
Let me think about that a second. We have a significant series of collections of the women who served in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and also the Women's Army Corps during World War II. And they're smaller collections, but these women didn't want their experiences lost. They didn't want their experiences forgotten. One of the collections is of a high school teacher named Rebecca Brokenbrough, who was in the very first WAAC class at Fort Des Moines. And she wrote these letters home to her sister and talked about how they were still building the buildings, and the mud was so bad that they had tow trucks that would pull the trucks out of the mud and they would wade through the mud. There weren't any sidewalks. There wasn't any heat in the buildings. And that the WAAC, the WACs, didn't yet have winter clothes and uniforms ready. And so she finally was able to get an overcoat that was so big because it was a man's overcoat that it just hung on her, and her classmates laughed at her, and she said she didn't care because she was warm. And so I think the stories of these women who were like Elizabeth, just very ordinary people who signed up and went on to do extraordinary things and helped win World War II. I think that we need to have more stories about these women.
Nicely said, nicely said. I do see one last question that came in, and I think it's certainly an appropriate one, is as we now know much more about Elizabeth Smith Friedman and her work, has the government corrected the untruths that her achievements were done by Edgar Hoover? And, you know, to what degree has the kind of government come around?
Well, I may not make any friends in the FBI by telling you this, but the FBI has on their website some of the historic cases that have been solved by the FBI. And one of them is called the Doll Woman case. And I have here in Elizabeth's collection her notes and her worksheets and her communications about solving the Doll Woman case. This is a woman who had a doll shop in New York City who was actually a Japanese spy. And so I have proof that she did the legwork, but on the website, FBI website, it says FBI cryptographers broke the case. And I'm like, what cryptographers? They had no cryptographers. They had Elizabeth. And so in some ways, yes, her record is being corrected, but in a lot of ways, we have a distance to go yet.
I seem to recall that Amy Butler Greenfield told me that there was an amphitheater or some room at I think at the NSA headquarters, which now has been named for Elizabeth Smith Friedman.
Well, the theater is named after William.
Oh, William.
Right, right. But you should know that the Coast Guard is finally celebrating their most prominent early woman. In fact, Elizabeth was the only woman working for the Coast Guard during the rum running years. But they are building a Coast Guard cutter down at Ingalls Shipbuilding in Pascagoula, Mississippi, that will be called the Elizabeth Friedman.
Wow.
And we are very excited about that because finally there's living proof from the US government about what a valued employee she was.
Wow, that's fabulous. Good to hear. Thank you so much. All right, I want to wrap things up. I thank everybody for joining. I'm hoping that Murray, we could get you to come back on and make any final comments or to close out our program.
I think I'm here. I'm not sure. Yes, I am. There we go.
Yes, you are. Yes.
Melissa, thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful insights about this iconic woman who is certainly under-recognized, undervalued, and hopefully will be an inspiration to all those young women and young men who say, I can do this. I can do this. I know I can. I have to say that as an English major with a minor within the Shakespearean department, she was amazing. I wish I had had her brain when I did my studies. So this has been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Murray. Thanks very much, Melissa, and all our viewers. Thanks so much and enjoy the rest of your evening. I hope to see you at some other programs soon.
Thank you for attending. Take
well,
care,
everybody.
everyone. Be well. Bye-bye.